Every day, a little girl passed a silent man on a park bench who looked like he had nothing. No home, no hope, no reason to lift his eyes. But when she offered him a sandwich and a smile, she unknowingly began a chain of kindness that would rebuild not just his life, but hers and her mother's too. He was no ordinary stranger. He was a man lost in plain sight, one with everything to give and everything to learn. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Maplewood Park, where joggers and dog walkers moved like clockwork through their daily routines. Children laughed in the distance, their voices rising and falling like the breeze that rustled through the trees. Amidst the steady rhythm of life, there was a stillness on the far bench near the duck pond. A man, slouched and silent, sat alone. His coat was tattered, sleeves fraying at the edges. His once white shirt bore traces of too many days without a wash, and his shoes were scuffed beyond recognition. His graying beard hung unkempt, and a woolen cap shadowed his downturned eyes. He looked like he had stepped out of a life forgotten by the world. But he wasn't invisible. Not to Liana. The little girl skipped along the path, her hand tucked securely in her mother's. She was 7, with bright, curious eyes and tightly coiled curls bouncing with every step. In her other hand, she held half of her sandwich, nibbling at it as they walked. As they neared the bench, she tugged at her mother's arm and stopped. "Mom," she whispered, glancing at the man. "Why is he sitting there all alone every day?" Grace followed her daughter's gaze. She had noticed the man before too, always in that same spot, always quiet, always watching. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said gently. "Maybe he's just thinking." Liana tilted her head, thoughtful for a moment. "He looks hungry," she said, her voice small but sincere. "Can I give him my sandwich?" Grace hesitated. It was a cold world, and one never knew people's intentions. But then she looked at her daughter, how her tiny fingers clutched the sandwich, how her eyes were filled with honest concern, not fear, and how the man, despite his appearance, looked more lost than dangerous. "Yes," she said softly, "if you want to." Without waiting, Liana walked toward the man, her little sneakers crunching the fallen leaves beneath her. The man noticed her approaching and straightened slightly, his brow furrowing. "Hi," she said with a small wave. "I brought you something." He blinked, uncertain whether she was actually speaking to him. She stepped closer and held out the sandwich with both hands. He looked at it, then at her. I don't need." "It's okay," she interrupted, smiling. "I already had enough. You can have it." There was no pity in her tone, no judgment, just a simple offer. One human being to another. His eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw something genuine in another person. He slowly reached out, as though afraid the moment would vanish if he moved too fast, and took the sandwich. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice gravelly and low. "What's your name?" "I'm Liana." "What's yours?" He hesitated. The name Jonathan Reed felt like a name from another lifetime. It didn't belong to the man on this bench. It belonged to someone with responsibilities, expectations, pressure. He wasn't ready to be that man again. "You can call me Mr. J," he said finally. Liana giggled. "Like a superhero?" He smiled, an actual real smile. "The first in weeks." "Maybe something like that." She gave a little nod, satisfied, then turned back to her mother. As she skipped away, Mr. J watched her go, sandwich in hand, heart unexpectedly lighter. Grace gave him a small, polite nod, which he returned. Then she took her daughter's hand again, and they disappeared down the path. The sandwich was ordinary, but the moment, it was extraordinary. As he bit into it, he realized it wasn't food that filled him. It was hope. And for the first time in a long time, he looked forward to tomorrow. The next day dawned with a quiet promise. The clouds parted just enough to let the morning light spill warmly over Maplewood, and by late afternoon, the park returned to its familiar symphony. Dogs barked at fluttering leaves, the swings creaked with laughter, and joggers moved in lazy loops around the pond. Yet on the far bench near the weeping willow, the man now known to one little girl as Mr. J sat again, still wrapped in the same worn coat, hands tucked into his sleeves, eyes scanning the path. But this time there was a subtle change, a flicker of anticipation. He didn't want to admit it, to himself or to anyone, but some small, stubborn part of him was waiting. For her. For the little girl with the fearless smile and the sandwich that somehow filled more than his stomach. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe she wouldn't come back. Why would she? He was just another ghost in the park. Then he heard it. The rhythm of small sneakers on gravel. The sound that had somehow embedded itself in his memory. Liana. She appeared from the curve in the path, holding her mother's hand and swinging her arm back and forth. She wore a pink hoodie today with tiny white stars, and in her free hand, she carried a small paper bag. When she spotted him, her face lit up with an enthusiasm so pure it nearly startled him. "There he is, Mommy," she whispered excitedly, tugging Grace along. Mr. J sat up straighter without realizing it, brushing his coat as if it would help. As they approached, he cleared his throat, then looked away, unsure of the rules in this strange new game of kindness. "Hi again," Liana called out. He glanced at her, nodding slightly, trying to suppress the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You came back," he said. "Of course I did," she replied like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I brought you something." She handed him the bag. It was light but neatly folded. Inside, he found another sandwich, this time peanut butter and banana, and a juice box with a straw attached. He blinked, a little stunned. "You remembered I said I liked peanut butter yesterday." She beamed. "And I added banana. That's my favorite." He looked at the sandwich, then back at her. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she interrupted, hands on her hips like a tiny teacher. "That's what friends do." Friends. The word hit him like a warm gust of wind. It had been so long since anyone had called him that. Long before the corporate wars, the media appearances, the endless board meetings that never felt like victories. Somewhere in the noise of success, he'd forgotten what that word really meant. "I see you brought reinforcements," he joked, holding up the juice box. Liana giggled and nodded proudly. "Mom says hydration is important." Mr. J looked over at Grace, who had remained a few feet back, giving them space but watching with quiet curiosity. He gave her a polite nod. "Thank you," he said sincerely. She smiled, soft and guarded. "You're welcome." Liana sat on the edge of the bench beside him, her legs swinging freely. "Do you like ducks?" she asked, pointing to the pond. "I used to," he said. "Haven't paid much attention lately." "You should watch them again," she said firmly. "They waddle like they're in a hurry, but don't know where they're going. It's funny." He chuckled, really chuckled, and it felt strange in his chest. Foreign. Almost uncomfortable, like using muscles long forgotten. The minutes passed easily. Liana talked about her favorite storybooks, her new sparkly shoelaces, and how she was learning to draw squirrels. Mr. J didn't say much, but he listened. Really listened. And every so often, he would nod or ask a question, and each time, her face would brighten like a star had blinked on inside her. Eventually, Grace called gently, "Time to go, sweetheart." Liana hopped up and waved at him. "See you tomorrow, Mr. J." "Tomorrow," he repeated, half question, half hope. "Yep," she said with certainty. "I'm bringing you something better." And just like that, she turned and skipped away, her curls bouncing behind her. Grace gave him a last glance, longer this time, and offered a quiet, thoughtful smile before following her daughter. He watched them disappear down the path, the last flickers of sunset catching their silhouettes. The sandwich was delicious, the juice box cold and sweet. But once again, it wasn't the food that left the biggest impression. It was her voice. And for the first time in what felt like years, Mr. J looked around the park and didn't feel completely alone. The bench was empty. The willow tree still hung low, its branches swaying lazily in the wind, brushing against the backrest like fingers tapping a shoulder. The ducks still glided across the pond in slow zigzags, occasionally diving for invisible treasures beneath the surface. The world moved unchanged, but Mr. J was gone. Liana stood at the edge of the path, her hand still resting in her mother's, but she wasn't moving. Her gaze was fixed on the vacant bench like it had betrayed her. A small crease formed on her brow. "Maybe he's running late?" she said, her voice lined with hope but already starting to shrink. Grace looked down at her daughter, choosing her words with care. "Maybe, honey. Or maybe he needed to go somewhere today." Liana didn't respond. She walked toward the bench without asking and sat on the edge, her legs dangling above the gravel. Her little hands clutched the paper bag she had carefully packed that morning. Today's sandwich was turkey and cheese, and she'd added a packet of cookies. She even drew a little smiley face on the napkin with purple marker, thinking it would make him laugh. But now the bag just sat in her lap. Unopened. Undelivered. She swung her feet slowly, the sound of her heels tapping the bench's edge the only sign of movement. "I don't think he would just not come," she said softly. Grace took a seat beside her. "Sometimes people don't say goodbye, even when they want to." Liana turned to her. "Why not?" Grace exhaled. "Because it's hard, and sometimes they don't know how." The little girl stared at the trees across the pond, watching a squirrel leap from branch to branch. Her chest felt heavier than usual, like the sadness was pressing against her ribs. "I should have brought him a drawing," she said suddenly. "I was going to draw him today. Maybe he left because I didn't." Grace wrapped an arm around her daughter's small shoulders. "Sweetheart, no one leaves because someone didn't draw them. You've been so kind to him. More than most people ever are." Liana nodded slowly, but she didn't believe it. "Not really." She sat quietly for a few more minutes, then gently placed the sandwich bag on the bench. She smoothed it out and folded the napkin over the top so it wouldn't blow away. "Maybe if he comes later, he'll see it," she whispered. The next day they returned. The bench was still empty. The sandwich bag from the day before was gone, but there was no Mr. J. No familiar coat, no slow wave, no deep voice greeting her with quiet gratitude. Liana checked around the nearby trees, even peeked behind the willow. Nothing. She sat again, this time quieter than before. No swinging legs. No humming. "I don't want to go to the swings today," she told her mother before she could suggest it. Grace nodded. They stayed longer than usual, long enough that the light began to fade and the cool air crept in, urging joggers to finish their laps and dogs to tug their owners toward home. Liana still watched the path, scanning every figure that approached. But none of them were him. That night, she didn't eat much. She kept staring at the drawing pad on her desk. The crayons lay scattered beside it, untouched. On the third day, the park felt colder. The sun was out, but it didn't feel warm. Not really. Liana didn't rush like usual. She didn't chatter on about what sandwich they should bring. She just held her mother's hand in silence, her steps a little slower. When they reached the bench, she didn't sit down. She stood in front of it, like she wasn't sure if she should even be there anymore. Grace waited beside her, watching her carefully. "You okay?" Liana sniffled and wiped her nose with her sleeve. "I don't think he's coming back." Grace knelt beside her and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't know where he is, sweetheart. But I know you did something very special for him." "I don't want to be special," Liana murmured. "I just wanted to see him again." Tears welled in her eyes, and this time she didn't stop them. Grace pulled her close, holding her tight as she cried softly into her shoulder. They stayed like that for a while, mother and daughter, alone on a park path beside an empty bench that had once meant something magical. And when they finally walked away, Liana looked back one last time. "Mr. J," she whispered into the wind. "Please be okay." It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind where time moved slowly, and the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen filled the space between thoughts. Rain had teased the sky all morning, leaving the pavement outside slick and speckled with drying puddles. Inside the small apartment, Liana sat at the living room window, her chin resting on the back of her hands as she stared out at the street below. She hadn't mentioned Mr. J today. Not once. But Grace noticed how her daughter glanced at the park every time they passed it on their walks, how she had stopped packing sandwiches in the mornings, how her crayons lay untouched beside blank sheets of paper. She missed him. She just didn't have the words for that kind of ache. Then the doorbell rang. A sharp, unexpected chime that echoed through the apartment. Grace was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of lentil soup. She wiped her hands on a towel and glanced at the clock. 4:17 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. "Liana, stay here," she said gently and walked toward the door. She opened it and froze. Standing there, framed by the soft gray light of the cloudy day, was a tall man in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. A light trench coat hugged his shoulders, and his beard was trimmed neatly, his skin clean-shaven around the jaw. Polished leather shoes. A gold watch peeking from beneath his cuff. In his arms, several brown paper grocery bags stacked neatly. Inside, she could see fruit, fresh vegetables, cereal, a bag of flour, and cartons of juice. Grace blinked. He looked familiar, but foreign. Polished. Composed. Then he smiled, and it hit her like a soft punch to the chest. "Mr. J," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "Hi," he said, voice quiet and steady. "I hope this isn't too much of a surprise." Before Grace could speak, another voice rang out from behind her, a gasp that shattered the stillness. "Mr. J." Liana bolted from the living room, her socks skidding on the hardwood floor as she came to a stop by her mother's side. Her eyes went wide, drinking him in. He looked like someone out of a movie now, like the kind of man who stepped out of shiny cars and spoke on phones with 10 buttons. But when he looked at her, his eyes softened the way they always did. "I missed you," she said without hesitation, her voice both breathless and trembling. He crouched down, setting the bags aside. "I missed you more than I thought was possible." Liana launched forward, throwing her arms around his neck. He held her tightly, not caring that his suit wrinkled beneath her grip. Grace stood motionless, hands still damp from the kitchen, heart thudding in her chest. She didn't know what this meant, but she knew it meant something. After a moment, Liana pulled back, looking at him with a tilted head. "You look different." He chuckled softly. "I cleaned up a little. Had a haircut. Took a shower. Maybe 2. You smell like a mall," she giggled. Grace finally found her voice. "Why don't you come in?" Inside the apartment, the light seemed warmer now. Jonathan, he had finally introduced himself properly, set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. Liana immediately began pulling items out with excitement. "Mommy, look. He got cinnamon rolls. And chocolate milk. The real kind with the cow on the bottle." Grace watched from the other side of the kitchen, arms folded loosely, still unsure how to process the man now standing in her home. He looked different, but his eyes were the same, thoughtful, searching, gentle. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, motioning toward the bags. "I did," Jonathan replied. "Because of what you did for me." Grace hesitated. It was Liana. She just cares about people. Always has. Jonathan glanced at the little girl, now placing apples into the fruit bowl with deep concentration. "You raised her to be that way." Grace didn't answer, but something in her chest shifted. That evening, after Liana had fallen asleep curled up on the couch with a book still open on her chest, Grace and Jonathan sat at the small kitchen table. A cup of tea steamed between them. He leaned back slightly, fingers wrapped around the mug, and for the first time, the polish of his suit didn't seem like armor. It was just fabric. "I owe you both more than I can say," he began, voice low. Grace said nothing, letting him speak. "I'm not who I seemed in the park. Not really. I wasn't homeless. Not physically, anyway. But in every other way, I was. I'm a CEO, Reed Technologies. You've probably never heard of it." She raised an eyebrow. "You're kidding." He shook his head. "I built it from nothing. I had money, power, attention, but somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a person. I burned out, lost my family, my drive, my meaning. So one day I just walked away, sat on a bench, watched people pass, wondered if anyone would even notice if I disappeared." His voice wavered slightly. And then a little girl offered me her sandwich. Grace swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She never asked for anything in return. I know, he said. And that's what broke me, in the best way. She saw me when I didn't want to be seen. You both did. And it made me want to try again. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of something unspoken. Something real. Grace looked at him for a long moment. You planning on disappearing again? He met her eyes unwavering. Not this time. And for the first time, she believed him. The rain came softly that night, like a lullaby outside the windows. A gentle patter against the glass, steady and calm, wrapping the apartment in a kind of stillness that made every sound inside feel sacred. Liana had long since fallen asleep on the couch, now curled up under a throw blanket, breathing deep and even. A book, The Little Prince, its cover worn from love, lay open on the floor beside her, as if it had slid from her hands just before she drifted off. In the kitchen, the low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as Grace poured a second cup of tea and slid it across the table toward Jonathan. The air smelled of chamomile and cinnamon. Soft light spilled down from the pendant above, warm and amber, casting slow-moving shadows on the walls. Jonathan held the cup with both hands, his thumbs brushing the ceramic rim. His suit jacket hung neatly over the back of the chair now, his collar undone, sleeves rolled up. In this light, he looked younger. Or maybe just real. Grace leaned back slightly, arms crossed over her sweater. She watched him closely, not guarded, but not entirely open either. Somewhere between curiosity and caution. He took a sip, then let out a breath that almost sounded like surrender. I haven't told this story to anyone, he said, his voice low but steady. Not my board. Not my staff. Not even my lawyer. Grace said nothing. She didn't rush him. She didn't need to. I built Reed Technologies from a 2-bedroom apartment, he began, eyes drifting toward the darkened window. First product was a data encryption service I coded myself. We got noticed, got investors, scaled fast. By 35, I had an empire. Private jet. Ocean view condo in San Francisco. People knew my name, followed my quotes, called me a visionary. It looked perfect from the outside. He looked down at the table for a long moment. But inside, I was crumbling. I was losing my grip on what mattered. I worked nonstop. Missed anniversaries. Missed birthdays. I burned through relationships like candles. Pretty for a while, but they never lasted. My marriage ended 2 years ago. Quietly. I didn't fight for it. Grace watched his fingers tighten around the teacup. Not out of anger, but grief. Not the loud, explosive kind. The quiet, aching kind. The kind that just settles into your bones. 6 months ago, I sat in my office and realized I didn't care anymore. About earnings, about board meetings, about stock prices. I had everything, and I felt absolutely nothing. So I left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. No press statement. No spin. I just walked. Straight to a bench in the park? Grace asked softly. He smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth tugging upward with irony. It seemed poetic. I used to sit there in college when I needed to think. I figured if I went back, maybe I'd remember who I was before the world started clapping. Grace tilted her head, voice gentle. Did you? He paused, then shook his head. No. I remembered who I lost. There was a silence then, not uncomfortable, but heavy. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, only understood. Jonathan looked toward the living room where Liana slept, her small frame barely visible under the blanket. I watched people walk by. Every day. Nobody looked at me. I was invisible, which, ironically, felt like a relief at first. But then she saw me. She stopped. She smiled, and offered me the only sandwich she had. Grace's throat tightened. She looked away, blinking fast. I almost didn't take it, he said. I told myself it would make me feel small. But when she smiled like that, I didn't feel small. I felt remembered. He looked back at Grace. And then you. You didn't pull her away. You let her choose kindness. That may have saved my life. Truly. Grace sat still, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and empathy. Her hands tightened around her own teacup, unsure what to say to a confession like that. "I didn't know you were that lost," she said quietly. "I didn't either," he replied, "until your daughter reminded me how it felt to be seen." For a long time, they sat there, two strangers no longer strangers. The weight of unspoken things settled between them, not heavy, just true. Grace finally broke the silence, her voice softer now. "So what now, Mr. CEO?" He laughed under his breath, a sound rough and real. "Now, I'm trying to figure that out. But I know I want to do things differently. I want to be someone who shows up." She studied him again. The man in the park, the man in the suit, and now the man at her kitchen table, stripped of performance, just present. "Well," she said, taking another sip of tea, "you can start by showing up for dinner tomorrow. I make a decent pasta." He smiled fully, that first true smile, the kind that starts in the soul and makes it to the eyes. "I'd like that." And for the first time in a long time, so would she. The days began to stretch out like golden ribbons. They stopped counting them. Jonathan came back the next evening, just like he said he would. And the next after that. No press, no security detail, no luxury car parked out front. Just him, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with takeout, once with a bouquet of sunflowers he said reminded him of Liana's smile. He started blending in so easily it felt almost like he had always been there. At first, Liana would run to the door every time he knocked. "Mr. J," she'd shout, practically launching herself into his arms. But over time, it turned into something softer. She'd be at the table doing homework when he walked in, and she'd simply smile and say, "You're late," like a little wife in training. And he'd ruffle her curls and say, "Had a board meeting," even if he was just stuck in traffic, and they'd both laugh like it was a shared secret. Grace watched it happen day by day. How her daughter started laughing more, how she started singing in the mornings again. How the light that had dimmed during Mr. J's absence had returned, steady and warm. And Jonathan? He began to move differently. Slower. Quieter. Like someone savoring every step. He no longer checked his phone during dinner. He didn't talk about shareholders or contracts unless asked. He spent more time learning Liana's favorite jelly bean flavors than reviewing stock indexes. One evening, they were all on the floor of the living room, building a lopsided Lego castle. Liana had insisted on turrets and a rainbow bridge that didn't quite connect to anything. Jonathan sat cross-legged, pretending to be an engineer hired by the Queen of Legoland. "Your Majesty," he said in his best British accent, "this support beam is structurally unsound. The entire bridge might collapse into the gumdrop moat." Liana giggled, tossing a Lego at his chest. "That's what the dragons are for. They catch you before you fall." Grace was curled up on the sofa, watching them, holding a mug of tea that had long gone cold. She hadn't said much that night, but her eyes were full. Later, when Liana had fallen asleep in her bedroom, Grace found Jonathan still on the floor, quietly cleaning up the plastic bricks. "She adores you," she said, leaning against the doorway. Jonathan looked up, his smile weary but content. "She saved me." Grace stepped into the room, kneeling beside him. "You saved each other." He looked at her for a long moment. The quiet between them was full of warmth. Not tension, not questions, just understanding. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he said softly. "Connection. Family. A reason to stay." Grace reached out, brushing a piece of lint from his shoulder. Sometimes we find family in places we weren't looking. Jonathan began to settle into their lives in ways that felt effortless. He became a fixture in Liana's routines, dropping her off at school when Grace had early shifts, cheering from the sidelines at her weekend soccer games, bringing her science kits and oversized sketchbooks. He never overstepped, never pushed, just quietly built trust. One moment, one smile, one gesture at a time. Grace noticed how different he was from the image she'd built in her mind of a CEO. He was humble, awkward at times, deeply attentive. He listened when she spoke, remembered the smallest details, and never tried to impress her with money. In fact, he avoided discussing it at all. He was becoming more than a visitor. One afternoon, as the sun cast long golden streaks across the kitchen, Jonathan stood at the stove trying to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Liana was coaching him with great authority from a barstool. No, the Stegosaurus needs more spikes. Yours looks like a squished lizard. I'm going for abstract Stegosaurus, Jonathan protested, flipping the blob with exaggerated flair. Grace walked in just as Liana burst into laughter. The room felt alive, bright, like the air itself was smiling. Do I smell burnt syrup? Grace teased, stepping in. No, Jonathan said too quickly. Just caramelized innovation. She raised an eyebrow. That's CEO talk for I messed up, isn't it? He grinned, flipping another shapeless pancake. Something like that. She joined them at the table, and for a moment, they were just three people sharing a messy breakfast at 4 p.m. No titles, no labels, no history. Just warmth. And in that small, domestic moment, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years. He was home. That night, after Liana had gone to bed and the dishes were washed and dried, Jonathan lingered at the kitchen sink. Grace stood beside him, drying the last plate. He glanced at her, voice low. I didn't think I'd be welcome in anyone's life again, let alone yours. Grace looked at him, eyes steady. You didn't walk in. You showed up. Every day. That matters. There was silence between them, the kind that hums with the electricity of something waiting to be said. I think I was waiting for someone to invite me to stay, he admitted. Grace placed the plate on the counter. Then stay. She didn't say it with a smile, or a dramatic pause. She just said it. Simply. Truthfully. And Jonathan? For once in his life, no boardroom, no title, no audience, he nodded and meant it. I will. The air buzzed with celebration. Liana's 8th birthday arrived like sunlight through clouds, warm, bright, and utterly impossible to ignore. Streamers in soft pinks and golds swayed in the living room, tied to every surface Grace could reach without a ladder. Hand-drawn signs made by Liana's classmates covered the walls, and the scent of vanilla cupcakes drifted from the kitchen where Grace was carefully applying icing swirls like a pastry artist under pressure. Laughter bounced off the walls. Music hummed from a small Bluetooth speaker in the corner. Plastic tiaras glittered atop the heads of children playing musical chairs, their shouts rising with every round. And in the center of it all, radiant, breathless, and beaming, was Liana. She wore a sparkly lavender dress that she had picked out weeks in advance with Jonathan's help. He had let her try on 5 before she twirled in that one and declared, "This is the one I want to feel 8 in." He hadn't questioned it. He had simply smiled and said, "Sold." Now, she stood atop a small footstool, waving at the group like a queen addressing her court. Everyone, she called, clapping her hands. I have something to show you." The room quieted, and Jonathan stepped forward, carrying a large rectangular object wrapped in brown paper and tied with a ribbon. Liana accepted it dramatically, struggling a little with the weight, then placed it upright on the table. She looked over at him, eyes sparkling. "Can I?" He gave her a tiny nod. "Go for it." With a flurry of tiny hands, the paper came off. Gasps filled the room. It was a framed painting, an illustration really beautifully rendered in watercolor. It depicted a little girl on a park path, handing a sandwich to a bearded man on a bench. The background was soft, like a memory, golden trees, a sloping pond, and ducks gliding across water that looked like melted glass. In the bottom corner, written in graceful cursive, "Where kindness begins, for Liana." Liana looked up at Jonathan, her mouth slightly open. "You painted this?" He nodded. "With some help from an artist friend. I told her the story. Your story." There was a silence. One of those silences that children somehow understand is special, so none of them filled it with noise. Then Liana said, "I love it." And Jonathan said, "There's more." He handed her a simple white envelope. Inside was a glossy pamphlet and a certificate. Grace stepped closer to read over her daughter's shoulder, and nearly dropped the cupcake tray in her hands. It was official letterhead. The pamphlet read, "The Liana Kindness Corner, a community children's library." Opening spring 2026, in partnership with Reed Technologies. Liana blinked. Is this real? Jonathan knelt beside her, eyes level. It's very real. We're building it on the old lot next to the park. Books, art supplies, quiet spaces. A place for kids to read and draw and dream. I used your story as the inspiration. You taught me that kindness doesn't just change days, it changes people. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, stunned. The room exploded in applause and little voices shouting, "A library! A library!" Liana threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Mr. J. You don't have to call me that anymore," he chuckled. She pulled back and looked at him with a mischievous glint. "Then I'll call you my other grown-up." Jonathan laughed, a full, deep laugh that carried weight and joy in equal measure. Grace watched from across the room, her heart clenching in that way it does when something sacred is unfolding right in front of you. Later that evening, when the last balloon had drifted to the ceiling and the frosting-fueled sugar highs had started to crash, the apartment settled into a rare kind of quiet. Grace stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes, humming a tune under her breath. Jonathan joined her, drying plates with a dish towel that read, "Cake is always a good idea." "She'll never forget today," Grace said softly. "I won't either," Jonathan replied. They worked in easy rhythm, like they'd been doing this forever. No grand declarations. No need to fill the air with promises. Just presence. Just being. Then Grace said, without looking at him, "Why the library, John?" He set the towel down. "Because people gave me buildings named after me," he said. "Schools. Labs. Auditoriums. But they were about what I built with money." He turned to her, eyes steady, honest. "This one is about what I built because of you too." Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. And in that gesture was everything: forgiveness, faith, affection, and the slow, certain beginning of love that didn't need fireworks, only trust. In the living room, Liana's birthday painting leaned gently against the wall. Beneath it sat a small card she had made herself with sparkly pens and clumsy handwriting. It read, "To Mr. J, thank you for seeing me. I see you too." The seasons shifted like pages turning in a gentle breeze. Spring melted into summer. The scent of lilacs gave way to the buzz of cicadas and the heavy sweetness of ripe peaches. The park came alive again, brighter somehow, more sacred to those who knew its secrets. The bench under the willow tree remained, but it no longer held the quiet weight of sorrow. Instead, it had become something else, a symbol, a beginning. And across the street from that bench, on a freshly cleared lot beside the duck pond, construction beams reached toward the sky like hopeful arms. The Liana Kindness Corner was becoming real. Children in the neighborhood stopped by daily to peek through the safety fence, imagining where their favorite books might live. A mural was already underway. Splashes of color, stories in paint, a swirl of diversity and imagination co-created by local artists and students. Liana had added her own mark, a purple heart outlined in gold, right above the entryway. Jonathan said it was going to be the library's unofficial seal. But something else was building too, something slower, more fragile, yet deeply rooted. At the center of it was Grace, Liana, and Jonathan. Three people who had once been strangers orbiting pain, and who now sat at the same dinner table most nights without the need to explain why. They just belonged. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in early July. Sunlight dripped through the tree branches like honey, the air thick with the hum of bees and lawnmowers. In the backyard of their small but cozy home, Grace adjusted the tablecloth as she set out lemonade and strawberry tarts. Liana was running around with chalk-covered fingers, having drawn a massive hopscotch path that looped around the garden and ended at a giant star with the word "Yes" scribbled in glittery chalk. Jonathan stood by the garden gate, slightly nervous in a pale blue dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, hands tucked in his pockets. He glanced over at Grace, who caught his eye and offered a reassuring smile. Liana had no idea what was about to happen. She was too busy counting her hopscotch jumps and declaring herself a world record holder. Jonathan stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. Hey, kiddo, he called. Liana stopped mid-hop, turning toward him with a wide grin. Did I beat my score? You crushed it, he said, walking closer. But I was wondering if I could ask you something. She tilted her head, curious. He crouched down to meet her eye level. You remember how you used to call me, your other grown-up? Liana nodded. Well, I was thinking maybe I could be that for real. Like official. What would you think if I became part of your family? Every day, every night, every pancake disaster included. She blinked. Her eyes widened as realization began to form. You mean like a dad? She asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded. If you'd let me. She didn't answer right away. She ran straight to Grace, grabbing her hand, pulling her forward. Mommy, did you hear that? He wants to be ours. Like forever. Grace laughed, brushing a tear away. I heard, baby. Jonathan stood, a little shakily now. Not because he wasn't sure of what he wanted, but because this was more vulnerable than any boardroom, any headline, any financial risk. He turned to Grace, taking her hand gently. I didn't think I'd ever want this again, he said. But I don't just want to be here for her. I want to be here for you. All of you. Every day. Every burnt pancake. Every spilled juice box. Every tired night and hard morning. Grace looked at him, her eyes full. Are you asking me? He smiled. I am. I don't have a ring yet. It didn't feel like a proposal. It felt more like a homecoming. But if you'll have me, I'll build the rest of my life with you. She didn't pause. Didn't hesitate. She nodded. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 yes. Liana shrieked with joy and leapt into his arms, nearly knocking him off balance. He laughed, holding her tight, and Grace wrapped her arms around both of them. They stood there, all three, under a wide-open sky in the middle of their garden, next to a chalk star labeled yes. A few months later, under a canopy of fairy lights and paper lanterns, Grace and Jonathan were married in that same backyard. The guests were neighbors, teachers, a few close friends, and a row of eager children from the park library project, including Liana, who proudly served as both flower girl and ring bearer. There was no grand venue, no live orchestra. Just joy. Just presence. Just love. Jonathan wore a simple gray suit. Grace wore a soft ivory dress that hugged her gently, flowing like water with every step. Liana wore a crown of daisies and carried the same drawing she had made over a year ago. Her, Mr. J, and a sandwich on a bench. They hung it at the reception. Later that night, when the dancing was done and the lanterns were flickering low, Jonathan and Grace stood together in the kitchen. Liana had fallen asleep on the couch, her arms wrapped around her stuffed giraffe. Grace turned to him, her voice quiet. You know, it all started with a sandwich. He smiled and kissed the top of her head. And a little girl brave enough to offer it. She nodded. We didn't just save you, John. You saved us too. And in the soft quiet of that moment, surrounded by love that had been earned, not given, he finally believed her. And so, the man on the bench became the man in their home. The little girl became the light in his world. And the woman with quiet strength became his reason to stay. It didn't end with a fairy tale. It began with a life. A real one. Together. Forever. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.